Cool. Welcome, welcome. Come on in. So, my name is Brin. I'm an associate curator here with not here at Fort Macon, but at the North Carolina Maritime Museum in Beaufort. As some of you may know, our site is currently closed for renovations. So, we're very thankful and we show our appreciation to Fort Macon definitely for allowing us to host our lecture series here. The lecture today is Trying Women, a history of women in the whaling industry. It's one that is very near and dear to my heart. Obviously, I made it and I'm presenting it, but one, because the whaling industry is a very large part of our local community and our local history. And often when I study history, it's not uncommon, unfortunately, to lose sight of the women as part of that history and forget and not acknowledge or not always understand how much they contributed. So my goal with this presentation today is to actually add their voice and their presence back into that history. Before I jump all the way into it, this is part of the Maritime Heritage Lecture Series. We do have lectures here at Fort Macon most Thursdays at 11 a.m. The next one we have will be on July 10th. Or no, I'm sorry, the next one we have is on next week, June 26th. And that is Gone with the Sea Breeze, Coastal Tourism in Antebellum, North Carolina. That'll be presented by David Bennett, our maritime historian. Then we're going to skip a couple weeks because of the holiday. And then on July 10th, we'll have Sensational Sharks, a history and conservation of sharks in North Carolina. As excited as I am as a historian for the Civil War one coming up next week, Sensational Sharks is a new addition to our lecture series, and that's being presented by our department head. So, Courtney, if you get a chance on July 10th to come in or Zoom in and see the presentation, I highly recommend it. Not to discount David Bennett's contribution, but Trying Women is why we're here. Obviously, the presentation. So women's involvement, as I said, with the age of sail has historically been overlooked or written off as trivial by historians. Over the past 50 years, fortunately, we've seen the sands of studies kind of shifting, and we're starting to see women's contributions and the study of them kind of progressively growing, which is a lot of fun. I have at the museum over the last 15 years have had a lot of opportunities to collect some of these resources and been able to put them together in this presentation for you. Can you click on the, and we're gonna do it, we're gonna do it. Will it not let you click? Okay, this is like, yeah. Yay, now it should let me do it on my own. Oh, it is not. I'm going to just have to say, look, there it goes. I can do it on my own now. We are good. The whaling industry was a prominent economic force, as I mentioned, especially here in Beaufort and in North Carolina along the coast. We saw a lot of whaling going on, but the East Coast of America also saw quite a bit of whaling. Historians such as myself have taken a look at the contributions of women, and unfortunately, whenever I've looked at the study of whaling, you'll notice a very lacking gender in a lot of these pictures. And these are some of the most prominent ones out there. And when I have asked around and said, you know, where do women fit into this picture, it's very common for me to have them kind of brushed off as just being out on the home front and supporting the men from home. But specifically, what were they doing is the question that I had. And to do that, to answer that question, I had to look beyond our shores. So I actually took a look at whaling practices in different communities around the ocean here. And we're going to see, so what we're going to do today is I'm going to tell you a little bit about whaling that happened in Basque, a little bit up here in Iceland, in the Faroe Islands, a little bit up in the Massachusetts, Nantucket area, and then of course here. The reason that I look to these other communities is because of the fact that the whaling industry and the whaling community of the North Atlantic is surprisingly small, in that we have these beautiful water currents that help connect us to these communities. Often coastal North Carolinians, even in historical documents, will acknowledge that they have closer ties with ports in the Northeast than they do even with Raleigh early on, because those currents connect them. Also, if you take a look at the whales that were being hunted in our area, you'll see that they also show up very commonly in these other communities. So a lot of the whaling practices that we have here in North Carolina, we adopted from these other communities. So as I try to puzzle together and find those women here in North Carolina, I was able to also look at those other communities to help me puzzle those together and find the pieces to what was missing. And after meeting with multiple other historians and a lot of research, it gives me goosebumps to tell you that I found them. I found the missing women, not all of them, but sometimes closer than I expected, sometimes further away. But today I get to share with you at least one of their stories, which is very fun for me. Here's some of some of the women as well. Did it not scoot? Oh, so here are some images of the women themselves, some from out of area. These are actually here from North Carolina, which is very exciting for me. I normally study earlier history, and when I started studying this history and I found these images, it was just fun to be able to see actual photographs of them. This one, it was just a very small insert, but there are the women on the beach, which was very telling for me that they're not just sitting at home cooking. I shouldn't write that off. Sitting at home and supporting is fine, but they were very actively out there in the industry doing more than keeping the house. They had roles in this whaling industry. And one of those women, I told you I have photographs of them. Unfortunately, Ann Ross, the one that I'm going to focus on today, I do not have a photograph of her. Her image has been lost to time. But Ann Ross is a North Carolina lady, that resident from about 1694, that tells us a lot about women's roles in North Carolina. And she's been a great example of what they were doing in the whaling industry, and help piece it together and give us an insight into all the women that would have been here in coastal North Carolina. Like I said, Ann Ross is the one we're going to focus on today. And that's because in the spring of 1694, a whale came ashore dead in Curator County, North Carolina. This whale, this is not the actual whale. This is actually a different whale that had died here in North Carolina, but just to illustrate for you, whale came ashore dead. Here in coastal North Carolina, we were not going out for year-long voyages to find these whales. Often the whaling industry, especially early on in coastal North Carolina, was just taking advantage of whales that were already naturally coming up on shore. Later on, they would do some shore-based whaling, but often in the historical documents, it's more taking advantage of those whales that naturally came up. In this case, like I said, spring of 1694, Curator County, a whale has come up onto the beach. This event would have caused a lot of excitement in the local community because it did give a lot of economic opportunity. There's a lot of materials in this whale that they could harvest and sell. Normally, as excited as they would be, this would not actually be it wouldn't have made it into the historical documents, but just telling you a little bit here. We know, but unfortunately, there was a lawsuit that would be later associated with this whale, and that's not surprising. The court archives in North Carolina are littered with complaints and lawsuits over the division of profits from harvesting these whales. And this is no surprise, as a barrel of whale oil in 1823, when adjusted for inflation, would sell today for the equivalent of about $200 in currency. To help put this into perspective, crude oil today goes for about $70 to $80 a barrel. So a very valuable material. And one large whale, such as a sperm whale, such as what we saw in that image there, could produce about 25 to 40 barrels of oil. So a lot of economic opportunity. And like I said, this would cause a lot of disputes over who gets the money and who ultimately breaks it up. While doing my research, I did take a look at a lot of, this is from a different presentation, but I looked at a lot of the different whaling industries around. Why are we talking about this? Okay. For my research, I focused specifically on the commercial whaling industry. So the commercial whaling industry, I do want to acknowledge, did peak in America between 1846 and 1852. New Bedford, Massachusetts sent out its last commercial whaler in 1927. Most people don't realize how recent that was going on. Even though we did not have commercial whaling here in North Carolina, well, as we think about it, pelagic whaling, such as what was going on out of Nantucket, those commercial whalers out of Massachusetts in the Northeast were coming off of North Carolina's coast initially, starting in about the early 1700s, to hunt the whales that were off of our coast. Now, we do see their influence over both our culture here in coastal North Carolina and over our whaling practices. Just like I said, I went around and I looked at all the different practices going around up and down around the North Atlantic to see how women were working with the whaling industry. And one of the examples that we can see here in specifically Beaufort, North Carolina, of the influence of the whaling industry and the whalers that were coming off of our coast could be found in the different houses that are seen around North Carolina, around Beaufort. One of these houses, the one on the left there, is actually, you can see that they have a very similar image to them. And I want to make sure I get this right. Where's my? On the left is out of actually Massachusetts. This is not a North Carolina house. No, that's the North Carolina. This one is out of Massachusetts right here on the left. And this one is the home that was built in 1830 by a whaling captain. Interestingly, he was the one that would ultimately on his crew have Herman Melville, who would later write Moby Dick. And then you'll recognize this house out of Beaufort, right down on Front Street. It is called Gibbs House. And you can see how they have very similar structural components. They have that very similar appearance. And if you drive around downtown Beaufort, you're going to see a lot of that influence on coastal North Carolina from the whaling industry. Another argument for looking towards them for their culture, for how they influenced us. Just to kind of break it up, I do want to mention, so the wives we see on these pelagic vessels, the women were not only supporting from shore, we were also seeing them show up on the ships themselves, especially on those longer voyages. The women would commonly go out with their husband, later on more commonly go out with their captains on these longer voyages. For example, this is Sarah A. Frisbee. She would live with her husband at sea for 20 years, ultimately giving birth to 3 of her 8 children while on voyages. 5 would unfortunately die in infancy, and she was described as a very resourceful woman. At one point, while on a voyage, interestingly, her husband would start using profanity that she would object to. He would tell her to go below, and ultimately, he should have listened to her, because right after having disrespected her in such a way, he would die at sea, and she would get her unspoken revenge there. So we see a lot of women being more interactive in more participants in the whaling industry than would originally be acknowledged by historians, but thankfully we're seeing them come out now. As I mentioned earlier, here in North Carolina, we're not seeing a lot of that longer distance whaling. In contrast to their counterparts around the Atlantic, the whalers of North Carolina never made the transition to pelagic whaling, choosing to focus instead on shore-based whale hunts. This meant that the men of the area would go on hunts measured in hours as opposed to months or years, and these whales would be brought on shore near the whalers' communities to be processed and prepared for trade. Though not well documented, the close proximity and economic importance of these whales has led historians to, not inaccurately, like I said, assume that women were involved, at least in a supporting role, processing and selling the whale products. Signs of the influence of the Basque, which is that community up in France that I told you about. They can be seen in North Carolina, notably in several areas of the 17th century Carolina whaling industry. that lends credence to my desire to look towards their gender practices. For example, there are many variations in styles of construction of whaleboats in North Carolina. A popular design was the double-ended lapstrake design. That's what you're seeing here. These are images of whaling boats that were here in North Carolina. This design was a basic form used not only here in North Carolina, but through much of the history of the whaling industry, but dated back to at least the mid-1300s when it was employed by the Basque shore-based shore whalers. So we're seeing that come together where we're getting a lot of that influence from other communities. Putting all of these together helped me illustrate for you how small, well, wrong slide. But we're going to go back to our girl, Anne Ross. So Anne was, like I said, that whale in 1694 had come up on shore, had caused a lawsuit. There was a lawsuit that we know on our books from Curator County the complaint was filed by a Timothy Peed and a Charles Thomas against a Matthias Towler, who interestingly would have had later on, Matthias Towler will have multiple complaints against him during his career. And what sets this complaint apart is from other whale-related complaints is the part that Anne Ross herself plays in it. She will actually show up in this complaint multiple times, being used as a witness in a time period where you don't normally see that. And in the complaint, the first mention of Ross shows that the assumption of women's involvement in the selling of whaling products, such as whale oil, was correct. So we saw that showing up in those other communities. And in this complaint, they actually mentioned that she was involved in the selling specifically of whale oil. It was stated that Ross was in possession at one point of 8 barrels of whale oil. And Ross would then give these barrels to Matthias Towler, whose negligence in payment was part of the complaint. 8 barrels of whale oil had a lot of value, with these barrels potentially equaling almost double the monthly salary of a skilled tradesman in England at the time. Ross's ownership and authority to sell these barrels, for me, demonstrates a role that women were playing in the storage and selling of this valuable material in coastal North Carolina. So she had these barrels of oil. She was supposed to be selling them. We're seeing what their involvement is. Back on this one. There we go. And an interesting parallel to New England women. So taking a look at, we see this practice of women being involved in the selling of materials and retail. We see it also happening up in the New England area. This is women that were part of what was called Petticoat Row in Massachusetts. And what's cool about these women is it was a row of businesses that were run by all of these women that are whaling wives. So their husbands had gone off to sea. They had to continue to support the household. And as their voyages got longer and longer, they were starting to find their businesses and really support the economy in a lot of ways. So we're seeing that parallel of that community had women out there involved. Yes. Was that Boston? This is, I believe this one, let me make sure I'm getting you right on this one. Because I want to say this is Nantucket specifically. Yes, Nantucket specifically. Petticoat Row occurred on. Yes. So the women were running a variety of different businesses. Some were selling whale products themselves. Most of them were focusing in on clothing and items for women specifically. I did see a couple stationery shops show up as well. Wonderful, thank you. And so we see women running those businesses. And another interesting parallel to another supporting argument for women running businesses and actually selling the whale products, I found a community up in Iceland. There's this wonderful archaeologist up in Iceland, and what she is doing currently is she is researching a whaling community, different whaling communities along the Icelandic coast, specifically in the north, Her goal right now is to do, amongst other things, is to identify the different species of whales that were being hunted there. She's using a lot of cool genetic testing to figure out exactly which whales, but she's also started to uncover the remains of stands that would have been used for processing and selling those whale products. And what she has started to do is identify markers that prove that women were there and that women were actually selling. And what she is able to do, as she has started to be able to confirm this marker at this site proves that a woman was here and that a woman was running this, then she's able to take that information to other archaeological sites that she has along the Icelandic coast and prove women's involvement in other areas of that culture as well. And we're finding very specifically here that they were supporting the whaling industry. And this is another place that North Carolinians would have been influenced by, as that, like I said, that small community. So we know, because of Ann Ross and because of the Petticoat Row and because of our Icelandic communities, that women were involved in selling whale products and also being involved in those booths. But we also know that to some level they were helping with the processing of the whales, and that's because Ross's name shows up again in the complaint, because she gives an oath at one point to prove that Timothy Peed, that he had worked 10 days on the contested whale. Whale oil wasn't the only material being harvested from these creatures. If that was it, it wouldn't have taken 10 days to get it out. Their bones, teeth, baleen, and possibly meat would have also been harvested for use or market. Depending on the size of the whale, it could have taken an extended period of time to harvest these materials. According to the New Bedford Whaling Museum, the process could take from several hours to several days, depending on the size of the whale and the skill of the crew and the weather. So keep in mind, 1694, these men were probably fishermen most of the time, not spending all of their time harvesting whales. So it would have taken them a little bit longer than would have been expected. So 10 days is a reasonable amount of time to take to process that whale. So Timothy Peed, what is telling about Ross's and presumably other women's participation is that Ann Ross was able to confirm Peed's presence all 10 days. This implies that she was present all those days that they were processing the whale. And in addition, the courts accepted her oath, meaning that it was expected and it wasn't outside the normal for this woman to have been there for those whole 10 days. So these are some items here that would have been made from whale products that come from the museum's collection. You'll see here an example of some scrimshaw, which is where they take the whale tooth and sketch in beautiful pieces of art on the side of them. That one was a whale tooth, yes. It's technically a sperm whale tooth. There's where it would have connected, and there's the point of the tooth right there. Yeah, they get quite big. I've seen them at the Whale Center. They don't get as big as they used to, but we have a historical one that somebody donated that is larger than a banana, I would say. It is impressive. And then this is made out of probably more in the way of bone up here. We also know that here in North Carolina, even though they did have a very common, they would take advantage of those whales that would come up on shore. We also had the dolphin fishery. We had a number of camps along, I'm sorry, skipping ahead on myself. We had a number of camps along North Carolina's coast that were used for fishing, but we do know that these camps would also be commonly used for whaling and taking advantage of later on when they were doing their shore-based whaling. And I like to point out here, because this is right here on Shackleford Banks, and the Whale Hill, which is where, according to oral history, they would stand up on what was supposed to be the highest sand dune in the area, relatively speaking, and watch for those whales to go hunting, was right next to their village, right here, where we would have known women would have been living down here. And so even though women may not have been going out and actively hunting the whales, their proximity alone would lend to them being involved. We do know in other industries, such as the fishing industry, you could see an image here Women were supporting them, supporting the fishermen through a variety of practices such as mending their nets. I love this image because they took this image of the women mending the nets, and this boy just kind of ran in with his dog. It's like, look at the puppy. So you see a little bit of personality coming through, which is always fun. We also know here in North Carolina, we had an unfortunate practice called the dolphin fishery. The species of the whale in the Ann Ross lawsuit is never actually identified. In coastal North Carolina, there's a variety of large and small whales, including the dolphin, which for the record is actually a small whale. And they were hunted. The dolphin fishery of North Carolina was more active than the larger whale fishery, mostly due to the fact that dolphins were just more common in the whaling industry in the local area. Both the dolphin fishery and the whale hunts in coastal North Carolina were shore-based operations that would have resulted in the local community being in closer proximity to the hunt, and this would have given women more of an opportunity to potentially participate than the pelagic style of whale hunts. The surviving engravings and photographs from North Carolina's dolphin fishery give more insight. So you can see some images here from the dolphin fishery here in North Carolina, but you will notice that there are unfortunately no women in there, which lends the argument to the argument that the women weren't actually part of the act of hunting. It would be later that they would become involved, or previously when they were preparing the nets, and then after they were helping with the working with the remains. Come on. One of the most common tasks that oral history attributes to women regarding presence of processing the whales is working the tripods, which is where the name of trying women comes from for my presentation. Tripod was a large pot used to remove or render the oil from whale blubber. Once a whale was killed and processed, its flesh and fatty blubber layer would be cut into pieces and melted into the tripods to extract the oil. This task could take over 3 hours, depending on the amount of material being processed, and would require almost constant stirring to prevent any solids from sticking to the sides and burning in the process. Despite oral history, locals saying, obviously, women were doing the tripods, I was not able to find any oral locals that had this family memory. It would always be, oh, obviously women were doing the tripods, but I never met anybody in Carteret County that was like, oh, I remember my grandmama would tell me how much this stank or how much she hated working the tripods. And if you're familiar with Carteret County or coastal residents in general, they have long memories that they pass down. So if there were women out there remembering having to do this very trying job, they would have passed it down. And all of the images that I was able to find associated with the tripods had images of men with them. So just like earlier when I had historians or saying, oh, obviously women were supporting at home, and I was like, but how? I want specifics. And thankfully, Ann Ross came through for me. The third time I mentioned to you, she showed up 3 times in this complaint. And she is one of the rare cases where a woman is solidly documented as working the tripods, because that complaint states that Ross, with the assistance of some of her family, tried up 3 barrels of oil out of the whale, which Matthias Towler afterwards took from Timothy P. As part of the complaint, Ross would request payment for the 7 barrels of previously mentioned oil and her labor processing the 3 barrels of oil. Assuming these were different than the 2 different sets of barrels, the ones that were taken from her when she was trying to sell that 8 set, and then this 3 set, the value of the 11 barrels would have been significant. So she has now had the labor for 3 and those other 7 taken from her. And so she's got a pretty significant complaint here. I'm happy to say that ultimately Towler was ordered to pay Ann Ross. He was ordered to pay her 51 shillings. Oop, there we go. 51 shillings and 3 pence to reimburse her for the barrels, those 7 that were taken from her, and the 3 that she did with the tripod, plus an allowance of an additional 16 shillings and 8 pence to reimburse her for the time she spent supplying witness for Pede for his 10 days on the whale. If you convert that to American currency, that works out to her receiving about $512 in reimbursement for her labor and roughly an additional $200 in an allowance for her time, totaling just over $700. This would have been a very substantial amount for any person in colonial North Carolina, but nothing compared to what we learned from her. Because of her, I have able to tell you that women in coastal North Carolina were definitely helping to sell materials associated with the whaling industry. They were definitely out there helping to some extent process the whales using their tripods. They were working the nets and helping to repair all of this materials. So she has been able to give me a very solid example of what women were doing in the whaling industry and help supply you with a little bit of an image of what they're doing. I appreciate you listening to me today. I appreciate you coming out. If you want to learn more, there's a lot of great resources out there. The Whaling Museum up in Nantucket has a lot of them available online. But if you would like to learn more, like I said, you are welcome to email me or check us out online. But thank you again for joining me today. They never identified Ann Ross's husband. I'm still in the process of trying to find her records, and that she might not have a husband. They only ever identify her as having a family that assisted her with processing, but her specific individual records, her name shows up like multiple times in this complaint, and it's spelled in 4 different ways, which makes it even tougher to try and track her down. And the complaint happens in Currituck County, but they do mention that she had to travel a distance to be there, but they don't say where she came from, which makes it even tougher to find her. So I don't know what her husband does or what her family was associated with. I want to know more about Anne. It's killing me that I don't, other than outside this complaint.
I have a really dumb question. What do they use whale oil for?
So whale oil was used for a lot of different. Whales didn't produce just one type of oil, depended on which whale you're looking at. Lighting was the most common. You would hear about lamps and lanterns using them. In the case of sperm whales, they have an oil called spermaceti oil that could be used as a lubricant in things like watches and then we know that dolphin jaw oil was very popular because it was used in, like, Swiss Army loved to put it in there as a lubricant in their watches because it has a very low freezing level. So a lot of different uses. The most common that you'll hear about, though, is the lights and the lamps. Yes. Changes year to year. Like I said, as excited as they would be, they weren't always documenting it. I know here today we see them. I don't want to give an exact number, but it's not uncommon. I want to say at least 1 or 2 every couple months, even today. We see dolphins coming up. We see bigger whales coming up. I work closely with the Bonehenge Whale Center, where they're part of the Marine Mammal Stranding Network. So I do hear on the periphery a little bit. I mean, you might know better than me how often they show up, because they show up on your beach.
We hear about close to us if they ask us to help.
Mm-hmm.
As far as bigger area.
Well, I'd say just in the Fort Macon area, you probably get 3 or 4 a summer or a year.
Sounds high.
High, okay.
13 years,
There you go.
Help, like, if the Marine Mammal Stranding Network doesn't come out and do a crop seal and try to figure out why this whale died.
Mm-hmm.
So it's an interesting process.
Yeah.
Stuff.
Yeah, so we weren't looking. Mm-hmm.
I saw one on the out on the ocean. And I saw a whale.
Mm-hmm. Isn't that cool?
They said, yeah.
Yeah, North Carolina's had over 35 different species spotted off of, or identified off of our coast. Yeah, it was, I want to say, I got my job at the Maritime Museum about 15 years ago. 2 months after starting, our natural science curator took me out to go see dolphins. And we saw 2 different types of large whale, dolphins, turtles, And he was like, I just want to stress to you, this is not what it's like every day. And I was like, you fooled me. And as a result, he hasn't been able to get rid of me for 15 years. But yeah, so I'd say as far as processing go, it's not a high number of whales. Dolphins being a totally different category as far as whale hunts go. But the larger whales, 1 or 2 a year, I think would be like a banner year for them to process. Yes. Mm-hmm. It was a whaling and fishing community. Mm-hmm. Oh no, they would get the large whales. Mm-hmm. Oh yes, they would have. We have stories of them going. They would see those whales, and like I said, they would do the shore-based whaling. So what they would do is they would get into those bass boats that I was those double-ended ones, and actually row out and hunt the whales that were coming closer to shore later on, not in the 1690s, but as time went on, and they would bring them onto shore and process them. So we do know that they were going after some of the bigger ones. We know sperm whales were definitely targeted in our area. We know right whales were as well, but they weren't too, I don't think they were too picky. A humpback whale was acceptable too. Mm-hmm. They would have left it on shore. They would have processed it right there on the beach. And then, yeah, they would have taken the meat or the oil after they had processed it out of the whale over onto shore to either sell or use. That makes sense today? Okay, good. Well, wonderful. Great question. Sorry.
So it was kind of like very.
We're still there's a couple of historians, including myself at the Maritime Museum, looking at those records because it is very difficult for us to tell how much was actually being shipped out of North Carolina. It looks like much of it was being used in North Carolina by the actual residents that were harvesting it. But we do know, we do have records of shipping of oil going out, but we don't know if that was oil that was being hunted or being harvested from the whales from our shore, or if it was just happened to be coming through our ports and that's why it's showing up on our records, or if it was one of the Nantucket whalers that had just come in. So we're not sure how much of it was sustenance and how much was being shipped off. But most of it was being used in-house. And then you started to ask.
Is it illegal? I mean, I don't know. My mind is like probably illegal.
Now, yes. Well, America does still have some areas that are allowed to whale for cultural practices, Alaska being one of them. But here in North Carolina, definitely not whaling. You're not technically, if you find a piece of a whale, even if it's just a whale tooth or a whale vertebrae on the beach, you need to leave it there because it is a protected species. So you're not supposed to have any of that material at your house. So no, not legal. Thankfully. Yeah. Wonderful. Well, thank you very much again for joining me today, and I'll be around for another few minutes if anybody has any more questions.